Black, Indigenous, and people of color have historically been marginalized members of the nuclear policy community, and similarly, during the pandemic, they've experienced disproportionately negative outcomes.
That's the voice of Mackenzie Cater. She and Jack Brosnan of the Nuclear Threat Initiative's Materials Risk Management Program are today's guests on Press the Button, a Plowshares Fund podcast dedicated to nuclear policy and national security. And now, here are your co-hosts, Tom Colina and Michelle Dover.
Welcome back to Press the Button. Hey, Michelle, great to see you as always. Hope you had a great weekend, and I hope you're getting excited for Press the Button Live. You know, I always thought, hey, why don't we make this show live and add some video to it? And guess what? That's exactly what we're going to do.
Hey, Tom. Yeah, I'm getting really excited. You know, we're going to find out how well we do when we don't have an editor behind us. So I think it's going to be really awesome to bring people behind the scenes of how we make this happen. And I think it's going to be some really good conversations.
I agree. And looking forward to the show, which, of course, is this Thursday, 2:00 Eastern. So please check it out. Some news updates for this week. Sadly, we are confronted with the death of Colin Powell, a really huge figure on the national security scene for sure. First Black national security advisor during the end of the Reagan administration, the youngest and first African-American chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff under President George H.W. Bush. But of course, he will sadly be remembered for his role in the Iraq War, when, as George W. Bush's first Secretary of State, he pushed the faulty intelligence before the United Nations to advocate for the war, which he later, I think, rightly called a blot on his otherwise stellar record. And I guess this is just a cautionary tale of what politics can do to people of integrity. And I do think Colin Powell was a person of integrity who ran into an impossible situation. But moving on to other news, China, there are new reports that China has tested a hypersonic missile that is nuclear capable. You know, this is all over the media right now, and the concerns are that hypersonics are harder to hit than the ballistic missiles that China and we already have. But, you know, I think people need to take a break and look behind the scenes on hypersonics. You know, as some of the media are starting to report correctly now, they're not any faster, and in fact can be slower than ballistic missiles that we already have. Yes, they can maneuver in a way that ballistic missiles can't. But, you know, we can't defend against large-scale attack from regular ballistic missiles as it is. So that's what deterrence for. That's why we have nuclear weapons, to deter attacks. And we simply don't have missile defenses that can defend us from large-scale ballistic missile attacks. So to me, hypersonics are not a game changer. They're just another weapon that's going to cost us a lot of money and start an arms race, and we're better off without. But let's not panic and respond in a way that does us more harm than good. On early warning, we're going to discuss yet another death, this one of A.Q. Khan, who is renowned as the father of the Pakistani nuclear bomb, honored as a hero by many in his country and as a villain by many outside his country. He's a complicated figure, and we'll sort of wrap all that up and try to explain his legacy in the show today.
And after that, I sit down with Mackenzie Cater and Jack Brosnan, who both work for the Nuclear Threat Initiative, where they support, as a part of their jobs, the Gender Champions in Nuclear Policy Project. They are here to talk about the results of a new survey that GCNP has conducted about the impacts of COVID on the nuclear policy field. And let's just say the findings are both horrifying, but also, in a way, uplifting. I definitely hope you stay and listen in for this really great conversation, and go look up the report later.
And as usual, if you like what you hear, remember to hit subscribe and leave us a rating. Your feedback helps us improve the show. And with that, let's get into the episode. The clock is ticking.
And now, early warning. A 7-minute synopsis of this week's nuclear news.
Thanks, Del. Last week, A.Q. Khan died at 85. He was a Pakistani scientist who was a hero to many inside Pakistan and a villain to many outside. He's regarded as the father of Pakistan's nuclear bomb, who after achieving that goal set out to sell the secrets to others, including North Korea and Iran. Here to help us understand this complicated legacy is Zia Mian, a physicist and co-director of the program on science and global security at Princeton. Zia was recently elected as a fellow of the American Physical Society. Zia, congratulations on that. And thanks so much for being here.
Oh, thank you, Tom. And thank you to everyone at Plowshares for this opportunity.
So let's talk about A.Q. Khan. Why don't we start with the hero part? You know, he is regarded as the father of the Pakistani bomb. Tell us about his role in that and how he's regarded now in his country.
So the story of A.Q. Khan is really a story about nationalism and the stories that some people in some countries tell about themselves and about others. Because no one ever only tells one story. You tell your story, but in your story about yourself, you're always the hero and the carrier of goodness and virtue. And you also at the same time tell the story of the other, who is always an adversary and a problem for you in various ways. And in A.Q. Khan's case, that story is the story of Pakistani nationalism, which is fundamentally wrapped up in the story of the relationship between Pakistan and India and their creation through the partition of the British Empire in India in 1947. So A.Q. Khan was actually born in India. And unlike many people, including my parents, who moved from India to Pakistan at the time of partition in 1947, A.Q. Khan and his family chose to stay in India. And it wasn't until quite some years later that he moved. And he has written about the fact that after partition, as an Indian citizen, he felt that Muslims like himself and others in his family were being mistreated. And it wasn't the India that they had imagined. And eventually they felt that they had to leave to move to Pakistan. So this kind of reluctant post facto embrace after a sense of persecution seems to have been a defining factor in his sense of Pakistan as a Muslim society that couldn't find a way to coexist peacefully with India because it had been difficult for him to do so. And his own ambitions had been frustrated. So he came to Pakistan, he trained in science and engineering and went abroad for his higher education, got a PhD in Europe, and then chose to stay in Europe. And so that's the other interesting part, that he was building a career working for a European company that made centrifuges, which are the machines that are used to spin uranium so that it can be enriched to a high enough level to be used as fuel for nuclear power plants, or if you enrich it much more, you can use it to make fuel for weapons. And the company he worked for was a Dutch commercial company that was doing this work. And that's the second part of the story, that this was the private nuclear industry that emerged in the 1960s and the 1970s because people thought there was going to be a big future for civilian nuclear power. And so you needed all these new technologies, and private sector industry got into this in a big way. And they were looking for smart young engineers and scientists to help develop this technology. And so A.Q. Khan became one of them. And so eventually the nationalism and the commercial industry reconnected after India tested a nuclear weapon in 1974. And A.Q. Khan went to the government of Pakistan and says, look, I know this secret uranium enrichment technology from the company I work for. It could help you make a nuclear weapon if you want. Pakistan had already started a secret nuclear weapon program. And he just offered them a technical set of information that Pakistan was otherwise struggling to get their hands on. And so that's why for many people in Pakistan, he's a hero, because he combines the story of their nationalism, that India is awful and we are good and we have to be strong and well armed to defend ourselves against them. And, he was heroic in the sense that, for them, because he went to the West and brought back this silver bullet that allowed them to make a shortcut to making their own nuclear weapons.
Now, he achieved that, which by many estimations was quite a technical achievement. But he didn't stop there, right? He then turned and started sharing that technology and those secrets with others. Tell us more about that.
So again, the story here is that A.Q. Khan used the design drawings and the components that he bought for centrifuges from Western companies, including US companies, who were all trying to sell stuff. That's what capitalism does, right? And if somebody says, well, look, I'll pay over the market price if you keep it quiet, many companies are happy to boost their bottom line. And so they did. So he bought components from companies all over the Western world, the UK, the US, Canada, many European countries, to make the centrifuges because he had the drawings, but he needed the actual components. So he bought that for years and years and years and succeeded in making a plant. And then for various reasons, which we can talk about, he passed on design drawings and capabilities to make centrifuges and centrifuge plants to a number of other countries. But there's nothing unusual about this. Right? The sharing of nuclear secrets, which was something that the United States pioneered and Britain pioneered during the Manhattan Project, is a way of showing to your potential friends that you are a real friend. I give you the biggest secret in the world, how to make nuclear weapons. So we can be really kind of solid allies here. And so that was part of it. And the second part was that money was to be made. And the biggest thing, though, that people need to remember is that people think that, A.Q. Khan was this kind of smuggler in a nuclear black market. We now know that in 1975, 1 year after the Indian nuclear test, and A.Q. Khan is starting to try and get this stuff that he's got in Europe, and he's still in Europe trying to get it to Pakistan, the Dutch intelligence service was following him around because the person he shared an office with in his European company went and told his bosses that A.Q. Khan is actually secretly photocopying all this information. And this whistleblower was told to keep quiet because the Dutch company didn't want to fuss. And eventually the Dutch Secret Service started following A.Q. Khan around, and they actually planned to arrest him one day. And the Dutch Foreign Ministry said, yeah, go ahead and arrest him, until the CIA intervened and told the Dutch government, don't arrest A.Q. Khan because we want to see where he's buying stuff from and where it goes. And so for years and years and years, the CIA allowed A.Q. Khan to do his business, both the buying of components and technology and the selling of components and technology, because they wanted to understand the nuclear non-proliferation market that was emerging. And the Americans told, and this is from the former Dutch prime minister, that the CIA told him, just let him go, let A.Q. Khan go, just keep track on him, tell us what he's doing. And the CIA actually had agents inside the A.Q. Khan network tracking everything that they were doing. So they knew all along about what was going to Iran and Libya and North Korea. They chose not to do anything about it. And the second part of this, and I don't mean to make the story longer than it needs to be, is that the time where the West and the United States in particular could have done something was at this time in the late 70s. And if you go back and read, even the Washington Post in 1979 has a big story about the city of Kahuta. And it says, there is this town, and Pakistan is building a uranium enrichment plant there using centrifuges stolen by A.Q. Khan from the Netherlands. So it was there in the Washington Post in 1979. And why was a fuss not made? The fuss was not made because the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan. And you can now read the memos from National Security Advisor Zbigniew Brzezinski to President Carter saying, look, it's really sad, but our non-proliferation policy towards Pakistan to shut down their emerging nuclear weapon program is not more important than the need to confront the Soviets in Afghanistan. So we have to be quiet with Pakistan because we need their support, because we need to go get the Soviets in Afghanistan. So throughout the 1980s, the US turned a blind eye to what A.Q. Khan was doing for the strategic interests of the Cold War to combat the Soviet Union. So when restrictions could have been placed, something could have been done, They chose not to do it. And every year, President Reagan would sign a waiver of congressional legislation that would otherwise have put sanctions on Pakistan for trying to make nuclear weapons and use uranium enrichment, because the Cold War was more important than proliferation.
Fascinating stuff. And we are almost out of time, but I don't want you to leave without telling us how you sort of sum up for yourself Khan's legacy.
Khan's legacy is one of the classic stories of the Cold War and of the nuclear age, where nationalism, national security interests, capitalism, and the structure of government in the United States and in Pakistan and societies all just play out the same processes, right? So in the Pakistani case, the leadership had a policy of don't ask, don't tell. Whatever it is, as long as we get the bomb, we don't care about anything else. The US, the Cold War was more important. So they have their priorities. And so it's a structural problem that we have. And A.Q. Khan was just one example of how these structures just play themselves out.
There's the siren. We are out of time. Zia, I want to thank you so much for being here and telling us this fascinating history.
Thank you, Tom.
Join us for Press the Button Live, Thursday, October 21, 11 a.m. to 1 p.m. Pacific, 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern, live on Zoom. Press the Button Live, Nuclear Policy in the Biden administration and beyond, will be an inspiring and informative discussion on the latest developments of nuclear policy, led by Plowshares Fund President Dr. Emma Belcher and Press the Button co-hosts Tom Kalina and Michelle Dover. Confirmed speakers include House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, Principal Deputy National Security Advisor John Feiner, Adam Smith, the Chairman of the House Armed Services Committee, Nuclear Weapons Policy Consultant Lily Adams, Dr. Jane Vainman of Temple University, and many more. For more information and to register for this free event, visit plowshares.org.
Hi, my name is Chase Enright, and I'm the Development Coordinator at Plowshares Fund. I'm also a dedicated listener to Press the Button and an advocate for eliminating nuclear weapons. Whether you're a baby boomer, millennial, or member of Generation Z like me, I believe it's crucial that we learn about and speak up on nuclear weapons issues. Because nuclear weapons affect all our lives. That's why in-depth discussions on nuclear policy and national security, like the ones on Press the Button, are so important. To help us continue our work and support the podcast, please donate to Plowshares Fund. Whether it's $5 or $5,000, every last bit helps. We rely on the generosity of supporters and listeners just like you to fund our work to foster the next generation of nuclear scholars and activists and spread the boldest ideas for reducing the global nuclear threat. As we often hear on Press the Button, our work is more crucial than ever. Please help us keep the conversation going by visiting plowshares.org and donate today.
Jack Brosnan is a program officer at the Nuclear Threat Initiative for the Materials Risk Management Program, where he supports the Nuclear Security Index and Gender Champions in Nuclear Policy. Mackenzie Cater is the executive assistant to NTI's Vice President of Materials Risk Management and its Chief Financial Officer, and she provides support to the Gender Champions in Nuclear Policy Initiative as well. They are sitting down with me today to share the results of a new survey conducted by Gender Champions in Nuclear Policy about working during COVID. Jack, Mackenzie, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks, Michelle.
So, what is this survey and why did you conduct it?
Well, over the past few years, the nuclear policy community has invested pretty heavily in planting new seeds and trying to strengthen its own existing roots. So we set out to explore whether the pandemic has jeopardized the growth in the community. And COVID-19 has had an undeniable impact on every professional space. And there's a growing body of research that shows that the pandemic's impacts have been gendered, but there's very little data that exists about the nuclear policy community itself. So in the first quarter of 2021, Mackenzie and I, through Gender Champions in Nuclear Policy, launched a public survey to gather responses from people across the community about their experience of working during the pandemic. And in all, we heard from 231 people representing all different sectors of the nuclear policy community, all levels of experience, and all different personal identities. Over 60% of the folks that we heard from identified as women, and about 2/3 were working at either NGOs or government contractors. We asked questions about work conditions, outlook, job loss, economic impacts, personal experience, and a number of other topics. And in all, what we heard was pretty troubling.
So what did you find?
We got both hard data and personal anecdotes. And one striking quote that we received is as follows. I had a baby at the beginning of the pandemic. Her father left when she was 7 weeks. So I've been without being able to work and having a steady flow of income. It's nearly impossible to work and have a very young child. One of the thematic areas that we set out to explore was the disproportionate impact of the pandemic on women's ability to participate in the workforce. There's a long established trend of an uneven burden of care work. That's things like caring for children, ill family members, relatives in the home that prevents women from being able to engage with the workforce. So one of our core findings was that the pandemic has increased that burden of care work. Among women who had their work hours reduced due to the pandemic, 86% of reductions were attributed to an increased burden of care work, and that was true for 0% of men. And similarly, women were nearly 2 times as likely to have experienced economic hardship as their male counterparts. So we immediately see a great disparity in the impacts of the pandemic across lines of gender.
I found it really, really interesting. One of the quotes that you had in a presentation that I saw a couple of weeks ago about how, quote, all employees were forced to take 5 to 15% pay cuts, and the management said this was necessary to avoid layoffs. Instead of laying people off, they are now terminating employment for other reasons. Morale is very low. Everyone up to this month who left was a woman or person of color.
So despite our limited sample size of BIPOC respondents, the GCMP survey revealed some extremely interesting findings about their experiences during this period. Black, Indigenous, and people of color have historically been marginalized members of the nuclear policy community, and similarly, during the pandemic, they've experienced disproportionately negative outcomes in comparison to other non-BIPOC peers. They were nearly twice as likely to have been separated from employment, more than 2 times as likely to have been taken or seen colleagues take pay cuts. 2 out of 3 BIPOC respondents were concerned that the pandemic would negatively affect their prospects for professional development or career advancement, and almost 20% more were likely to have experienced financial hardship due to the pandemic than their non-BIPOC peers. In addition to the 2 themes, we also were very interested in this emerging trend around talent retention. And I'd like to share a quote we found in relation to that. I graduated an A student with research experience and 4 years of job-related extracurriculars. I applied to over 100 internships, fellowships, jobs before I got an opportunity that I now have. I had to work in a bakery to be able to pay rent, despite the fact that I have pre-existing conditions that make me particularly susceptible to getting severe COVID. And I just found this to be, there is some, glimmer of hope, but she ended up getting a job as an intern and had to apply to hundreds of different opportunities before finding something. And, the very little glimmer of hope within this quote was just kind of a bit shocking. And so going back to this theme of talent retention, the importance of a healthy professional pipeline is widely recognized, but students have been underserved and in some cases are being pushed out of the field. More than 1/3 of students were separated from employment during the pandemic, more than any other career group. And nearly 2 out of 3 students agree that they experienced financial hardship during the pandemic, once again greater than any other career group. And what might not come as any surprise, 94.1% of students agree that the pandemic had negatively affected the quality of education they received.
We're reading a lot in the news about the Great Resignation or the Great Reassessment. Did you see similar trends in your respondents about considerations for leaving the field?
Yeah, I would say this was one of the surprising takeaways that we've found. We had kind of 2 big takeaways, but One was around the theme of a crisis of confidence. So during the survey, respondents were asked to indicate whether or not the pandemic had impacted their perceptions of the importance of their work. And across the board, individuals indicated that the pandemic had negatively affected their opinion of the importance of their work. However, the alarming trend was that of students and early career individuals. Some of the numbers we recorded were 35% of students and 42% of early career respondents indicated that the pandemic had negatively affected their perceptions of the importance of our work. So this really told us that those who are less established in this field are becoming more difficult to retain due to the effects of the pandemic. And even before the pandemic, the nuclear policy community was already experiencing retention issues among early and mid-career cadre. And now the pandemic has really exacerbated this crisis of confidence and could potentially further damage this already depleted guarded.
What was your other surprising finding?
So this was kind of around the idea of the participation of nuclear-specific media requests and speaking engagements. So during the survey, we asked respondents the question, have you observed a change in the volume of nuclear-specific requests you have received in input or as an appearance as a subject matter expert? So this could be anything from authorship, media quotes, and speaking engagements, and anything along those lines. And respondents had a few different options and what they could indicate. You could either say yes, increase, no, decrease, no change, or I do not typically receive such requests. So this question was initially designed to capture whether or not there was an increase or decrease in nuclear-related requests. However, this question revealed some very interesting information when we looked at the results and broke them down by career level. What we found was that 47% of mid-career individuals identified that they typically don't receive these requests. So we found this quite shocking because these individuals are more qualified. They're definitely qualified to take on such requests, yet they weren't receiving them. And we just see this as a way that like an entire, a big portion of a talent pool is going untapped in a large way.
I would really echo what Mackenzie has just offered here and say that, what I find maybe most surprising is when you stitch all of these things together. I think folks who have been in the community for a long time would attest to the fact that there is a great challenge at the mid-career level, both in finding and creating opportunities, in elevating those folks and preparing them for future leadership. But based on the findings that Mackenzie's just outlined, you can see that a number of those folks are strongly considering whether it's worth remaining in the field. And they're also not receiving the profile, the attention, and the respect that they so well deserve. And I think pandemic aside, that's something that's worth considering. But when you factor in the additional impacts of the pandemic and its impact, particularly on women, on folks who identify as BIPOC, who are already marginalized by our society and have a greater struggle in accessing opportunities, those factors together really call into question the future of the community.
So what does this mean then for supervisors or even coworkers? How do you pull the field back from this huge talent loss?
I would say that our first step is to recognize the symptoms of the problem. Something that's unique about the nuclear policy community is that unlike many other sectors of the economy, we didn't see rampant job loss or, overwhelming results in experience of economic or financial hardship. And in that way, our community has adapted to remote, flexible work conditions, things like that. And by and large, people have been able to continue in some capacity. But the effect that that's had is of concealing the impacts of the pandemic. And what that means is that, 5-10 years down the line, if we don't effectively address these symptoms, we'll be dealing with compounded challenges. And our community has worked hard to address gender equity and racial justice and building a strong talent pipeline and enriching a mid-career cadre that represents the future of leadership. But the work that remains now is to address the challenges that the pandemic has produced. So our aim in developing and launching the survey was to highlight these impacts and to figure out where the community can be strategic in attempting to shore itself up, to address specific challenges and to support marginalized groups, to ensure that attrition and loss of talent and lack of opportunity don't jeopardize the community's ability to move forward. And that leaves a great challenge at all levels, I think, for folks in leadership, for middle management, and for coworkers. I think this starts with awareness.
We are this garden, and it's already a garden that's kind of depleted in a way. And we really need to get to the root of this problem and ensure that we're providing a space and we're really fostering new voices for, marginalized community, also for women, and hopefully, looking towards a brighter future where they are not only, encouraged to seek further opportunities, but they're really allowed, we should be seen as a community that people want to join because of our ability to uplift women or people of color.
I hesitate to ask, but were there any bright spots in what you heard?
I'm actually really glad that you asked, Michelle, because one core finding that we're really proud of is directly connected to gender champions in nuclear policy. So when folks filled out the survey, we asked them whether they were working for an employer who was part of the Gender Champions in Nuclear Policy Network. And about half of respondents, something like 47%, were in fact working for gender champions. And among those who were in that position of working for a gender champion, their outcomes were across the board better than their peers outside of the Gender Champions network. Their positions were more stable. They were less likely to have lost jobs or had work hours cut. They were more likely to have had performance reviews, to have access to professional development funds, essentially any positive metric of stability and a healthy workplace through the pandemic was more present in workplaces led by gender champions than in workplaces not led by gender champions. And of course, we can't claim direct credit. And, we'll say over and over again, correlation is not causation. But a core tenet of being a gender champion is a people-first principled approach to leadership, of valuing your employees for the human beings that they are and caring for them above all else, placing that on the same level as the mission-critical work that you do to reduce nuclear threats. And we see a direct impact there. So as we consider what comes next, as we consider what the implications are for supervisors, for coworkers, those principles matter. They really seem to be at the heart of what we can do to address these challenges. And that's a message that we'll be carrying with us everywhere we take this survey and everywhere we have this conversation.
Speaking of which, what comes next for the survey?
Well, that's a huge question. And that kind of depends on what the community is willing to do. But for our part, we're working hard to address specific findings from this survey, and we're working hard to use it as a point of leverage to open additional conversations. In partnership with Rethink Media, we'll be opening shortly an opportunity for a cohort of 30 women to receive some professional development training on a topic of their choosing. And we'll also continue our work in bringing these findings and this conversation to professional networks throughout the nuclear policy community. And we've already engaged a number, including the Peace and Security Funders Group, the International Nuclear Security Forum, and the Gender Champions in Nuclear Policy Network itself. And we welcome requests from folks and approaches of any kind to discuss these findings. But we'll be using our particular Gender Champions approach to engage folks in positions of leadership, to dig in on these issues, and to work for their employees to improve outcomes and to address these findings to make a more inclusive, diverse, and equitable workplace and professional community that is welcoming to women, people of color, other marginalized groups, and presents equity of opportunity, because we firmly believe that those types of measures are what improve our outcomes as a community in achieving our mission critical goals. But they also, as Mackenzie so eloquently said, make this a community worth working in and address those challenges to retention, to talent acquisition, and all of the things that we so deeply care about and have invested in for years now.
I will also say we have some really exciting developments. We are in the process of working with Shelto to develop a digital exhibition, which will be hosted on a website, which will feature elements of our recent survey on these gendered impacts. So during the survey, we've received a wide range of anonymous qualitative data in the form of short stories from a wide range of individuals in this community. And it really illuminated, a lot of people's experiences trying to balance life during the pandemic, while still trying to stay relevant. And GCMP is interested in sharing this information beyond the typical DC report. So we hope that we'll have, this exhibition up here in the next few weeks, and it will kind of stay out there as long as possible for people to view and really almost bring like an art form to all the responses we received.
And speaking of which, where can listeners go to find the full results of the survey?
To access full results of the survey, information about what Gender Champions is and what the initiative does, our other work on a number of other topics, and for resources to get started in engaging with some of the findings from the survey and some of the challenges around gender equity, inclusion, and diversity in the community, you can find us at gcnuclearpolicy.org, as well as on Twitter at gcnuclearpolicy.
Jack, Mackenzie, thank you so much for all the work you do, and thank you for sharing such stunning, horrifying, but also hopeful results. Really looking forward to seeing what comes next.
Thanks, Michelle, and thanks for having us today.
Yes, thank you so much.
Thanks for listening to Press the Button. This podcast is produced and edited by Alex Hall in Washington, D.C., and Delphine Vigil in San Francisco. Research by Desiree Cepetis and Harry Tarpey. Audio engineering and sound design by Michael Padilla and the Soundport Recording Studio in Grass Valley, California. Our theme song is by Lyrics Born and the Poets of Rhythm, sampled with kind permission. Additional music by San Francisco-based bands 17 Evergreen and the Society of Rockets. To continue the dialogue and support our work, visit plowshares.org.